Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you very much for your kind introduction. I would like to acknowledge a number of individuals and groups that have made it possible for me to be here this evening. The director of the West Africa region for Ford Foundation, Innocent Chukwuma, other personnel of the Ford Foundation, the Power of International Education, and of course, Nana Ude and Patrick Okibo, and the Center for Memories and all personnel affiliated with the museum, including its directors, patrons, and resident historian. Thank you. It is truly an honor to be here. I want to believe that the museum has or is building a library, so I have whoever is representing Center for Memories, I have 2 books for you. And so you can receive them at the end of my talk. It's good to be back in Enugu, for which I have fond memories. I spent a significant part of my growing up right here in Enugu. I want to thank you for opening up the museum to welcome people like myself. This is an indication that you are exploring Igbo cultures, histories, narratives, and lifestyles, not in isolation, but as a fundamental part of the larger Nigerian, African, and global experience. This gesture is also important because, more than ever, it is time for us to break down barriers that continue to hold us back and make us vulnerable to all kinds of destructive forces. My talk today is titled Post-BIAFRA Healing, the need to reclaim ancient or pre-colonial ties. To a large extent, the problem we face today is a problem of colonial boundaries, which are boundaries that have either been introduced, altered, or intensified by colonialism. We're not just talking about geographical boundaries, we're also talking about economic, social, political, and religious boundaries. In some societies, we even have racial and color boundaries. They do not only exist between countries, but within countries. I will be highlighting these boundaries that separate us, illustrate how they continue to separate us as a region and a nation, and offer recommendations on how we can begin to dismantle them. Now, it is safe to say that we have achieved remarkable healing since the end of the Civil War. After all, our communities were decimated. A number of our loved ones and family members were murdered in large numbers. Our girls and women were raped. Our businesses were destroyed. Our homes were destroyed. Our lands were occupied. And at the end of the war, many of us were destitute because we had nothing. We didn't have our homes. We didn't have a means of livelihood. And even though there are some who think that 20 pounds was given to us and that would help us recover and develop ourselves, I want to let you know that most of us didn't even get that 20 pounds, which would have amounted to nothing. But let me say this. In spite of all the destruction, one way or the other, we have been able to reinvent ourselves to the point that we continue to excel in the humanities, in science, in the arts, in sports, in technology. And so if anybody tells you that there was no victor or vanquished, it is not because someone said so, it is because you and myself refused to be vanquished. We refuse to stay down like we were supposed to stay down. However, there's still a lot of work to be done. There is a greater need right now to ensure that history does not repeat itself, and that is the basis for my topic. When we think about boundaries, think about religion. Religion was never a source of division or conflict amongst our people. A lot of our religions and spiritual practices, for one, were related, and even where they were different, we respected them. In trade, we had more free trade. Today, I can't even get a flight from Enugu to Uyo, an indication that there's hardly any commercial activity between the people. If there was significant commercial activity, there would be at least 4 or 5 flights. Today, essentially, the emphasis is on controlling one's domain and resources rather than engaging in commercial transaction. And even in the area of language, we were more connected linguistically. If there are any of you who has relatives that belong to the generation of my parents and my grandparents, you will recall that many of them could speak 2, 3, or more languages. My grandfather could speak Igbo, even though he was an Ibibio man. My mom can speak at least 4, perhaps more Nigerian languages. In the past, in a lot of our boundary areas, people spoke related languages or they could speak each other's languages. Isn't it ironic that today, in a place like Cameroon, one of the major conflicts is between people who are English speaking and people who are French speaking? How absurd is that? Boundaries did exist prior to colonialism. It doesn't mean that we didn't have boundaries. They existed, but they were not rigid. And there was also inter-ethnic conflicts. There's no doubt about that. For instance, there's a lot of talk, quite a number of people know about the wars between the Ibibios and the Aros. But do we get a sense of permanent animosity? Absolutely not. In spite of those conflicts, the people continue to share a lot linguistically, culturally, and spiritually. That's why you'll find among these people similar traditions and practices. Whether it's that symbolic form of writing known as Nsibidi, or the Ekpe and Ekpo societies. You go to Abia State, you go to places, you go among the Effiks, the Ejagam people, the Ibibio people. All these practices and traditions are an indication of the nature of the interaction between the people. This means that cultural sharing and interactions took place even with groups that had been in conflicts because of non-rigid boundaries. There is therefore a clear difference between rigid versus fluid boundaries. Fluid pre-colonial boundaries were encouraged continued interconnections. Where there was conflict, they gave room for natural reconciliation because the people continued to interact and share. More rigid artificial colonial boundaries created renewed rivalries and conflicts. Today we are increasingly becoming territorial. It's now we against them rather than we in cooperation with them. The emphasis is on how much we are in charge of our individual spaces, which continues to push us further apart from each other. One of the tragic consequences of colonial boundaries is the fact that there are groups who either shared so much in common for generations or who lived in harmony for centuries, and these groups would come into conflict, and sometimes the conflicts were vicious and violent. That was the case with the Hutus and Tutsis in Rwanda in 1994 during the Rwandan Civil War. These were virtually the same people in terms of language and cultures, and they lived in peace for many years. In my state, every once in a while you hear about political squabbles between the Ibibios and the Anangs, who are again virtually the same people in terms of customs and values. Whenever I listen to people, when I listen to Ikwu people and Igbo people talk, many times it's about conflict, it's about disagreement and accusation. Many times the Igbo people are telling the Ikwu people, you're denying your Igbo ancestry. The Ikwu people are saying, no, we are not. We were colonized by you, and what we are trying to do is regain our original identity. I remember an argument when I was doing my NYSC between an Igbo youth corper and an Ikwu youth corper whose name was Amadi. They were arguing over this subject. And at some point, the Igbo youth corper said, well, you're changing the names of your communities by adding R to them to de-emphasize our presence there and to exclude us. So Umumasi is now Rumumasi. Umubiakani is now Rumubiakani. why don't you add R to your name so that we start calling you Ramadi instead of Ahmadi? And let me just add that when we think about something that's not often talked about is the fact that the massacres that took place in 1966 in the north, where Easterners, mainly Igbos, were victims, one of the things that hasn't really been talked about a lot is that a lot of those Igbo victims and a lot of the Easterners who were victims, in terms of language, in terms of culture, were really Northerners. A lot of them, even though their names were Ndubisi and Ngozi and Emeka, really couldn't speak Igbo. Many of them learned Igbo when they returned to the East, but they could speak the dominant language of the North, which was Hausa. So essentially, they had been destroyed and killed by their own brothers and sisters. Now, our pre-colonial boundaries were so flexible that they encouraged the tradition of welcoming strangers and giving them land to settle in. So when we talk about Sabongari, for instance, in northern Nigeria, it's a pre-colonial phenomenon, and it existed in many areas in West Africa. In Ghanaian society, in Mali, Timbuktu, and in a number of other African empires and kingdoms, these traditions existed. And generally, the strangers who came lived in peace among the people who gave them space to settle. But colonialism changed relations and dynamics between settlers and indigenous people who welcomed them. Strangers were increasingly seen as competitors for the new amenities as well as the new political and economic opportunities introduced by the Europeans. Also, a lot of the settlers showed more loyalty with time to the European authorities as opposed to the local authorities that had granted them space. And this would create tension between the settlers and the original owners of the land. Now, in post-colonial societies, the situation worsened. Visitors were seen as political threats to the ethnic and regional boundaries created by colonialism, and this is one of the reasons, perhaps not the only reasons, why we had those massacres in the north. In general, there was now increased consciousness for personal space, which meant that anything outside that space was a potential threat or enemy. Now, as we moved closer to independence and post-independence, there was therefore an increased anxieties over space and boundaries. Some of you have probably heard about the disagreements between two major Nigerian statesmen, Dr. Nnamdi Azikiwe and Professor Eyoita, which eventually led to Eyoita leaving the party that they belonged to, which was the National Council of Nigeria and the Cameroons. And he would eventually be he would be instrumental in forming a new party that supposedly catered to the interests of minorities in the eastern region. And this party was the United National Independence Party. First of all, it is interesting that disagreements between two individuals came to be seen as disagreements between ethnic groups. And even when these individuals settled and were no more quarreling, the rest of us continued to quarrel on their behalf. Now, the new party that Eyoita was a part of would go ahead to demand the creation of a Calabar-Ogoja River State for Eastern minorities. But this wasn't the first time this was done. The Ibibio Union, as far back as 1948, was already making such demands for a state for minorities in the eastern region. This was not also restricted to the eastern region. You had a Midwest state movement. You had a Middle Belt state movement. And in some cases, the campaign for territory became extreme and even violent, as in the case with Isaac Burrow in 1966, who tried to create a Niger Delta Republic and created a small army for that purpose until he was defeated by federal forces. So essentially, everyone was becoming overtly conscious of owning and protecting their domain and excluding others from their territory. We can't overemphasize the power of togetherness or unanimity. Many of us here are familiar with what many people refer to as the 1929 About Women's Riot. First of all, it wasn't a riot. It was well organized. It was a revolution. And it may have started in areas around Aba, but eventually women from all parts of the eastern region became a part of that movement. My own grandmother participated in it. And to this day, you have monuments in places like Nkata that are built to recognize these women. Now, we should remember that these women were coming up against a formidable force. And the colonialists themselves were quite patriarchal. They didn't recognize women. And so for these women to eventually succeed and get the colonial authorities to change taxation laws and other repressive colonial laws was unprecedented. But how were they able to do it? They were able to do it because of their togetherness. Let's imagine that today there is a crisis, and an Efik woman tries to invite Ijaw women and Igbo women and Oron women to come and participate in fighting against that crisis. It is not likely that we'll get the same kind of unanimity that we had in 1929. The question is, why not? Essentially, today we are increasingly becoming fragmented and powerless against larger threatening forces. Whether those forces are oppressive governments, whether it's Boko Haram, or like some people, and a lot of people are now talking about Fulani herdsmen, we are increasingly, because we are increasingly fragmented, we stand no chance against them. And that is part of my point. But that's part of the core of my talk today, and I'll say a little bit more about that. But just as there's power in agreement, there's also power in fragmentation. Apartheid in South Africa thrived on fragmentation. That's how it survived and succeeded for many years. We are increasingly becoming fragmented. And on the surface, when we are giving our states and our local government areas and we continue to chop ourselves up into tiny bits and pieces, we get the sense, or we think, that we're increasingly becoming independent and autonomous. But the fact is, we're increasingly isolating ourselves. And as we balkanize ourselves, we become weaker and weaker. The federal side, just before the Nigeria-Biafra Civil War, understood the power of disintegration, which is why they created states. They didn't give us states because they loved us. As soon as they created those states, it isolated the minorities in the eastern region from the Igbos, who were the majority group at the time. And I use the word minority very loosely because we were certainly not minor. And many of us went on, because we were passionate about the Biafran vision, went on to fight to the bitter end. But unfortunately, disagreements, disunity was sown into the fundamental principles of Biafra. And even if Biafra may have not won the war, that was a major factor in bringing about the demise of Biafra. The disagreements and the disunity that were sown into the region through the creation of states. And there were many who would eventually come to deny that they were part of the Biafra experience, just because those states and those boundaries gave them a sense of owning their own territory. And so it was a wise decision. It wasn't a friendly decision, but it was a wise decision, and it worked against Biafra. Now, it is the threat of disintegration that led to the early Pan-Africanist movement. Pan-Africanism just essentially means uniting Africans and African descendants in liberation struggles. They insisted that for Africa to protect itself from other world powers, we need to unite. There were many well-known Pan-Africanists in the diaspora and here on the continent, from Marcus Garvey and W.E.B. Du Bois to people like Sekou Touré and Patrice Lumumba and Kwame Nkrumah and many others. But I'm going to focus on Kwame Nkrumah, who insisted. The man saw ahead. His vision, when he looked ahead and saw things, it was as if he just wasn't speaking for Africa, but for Nigeria. He insisted that Africans must not look east or west for progress, but must look forward and work together to look forward. In 1963, when African heads of state, about 32 of them assembled in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia, Nkrumah called for a United States of Africa. He called for the creation of a single African currency and a single central bank for the African continent. He also called for more flexible regional boundaries. But most of the leaders disagreed with him because they were already enjoying the trappings of power, and they preferred the trappings of power which they were enjoying in their individual spaces. They enjoyed that better than the thought of having a united African continent. Remember that with new boundaries and territories come new powers. And so these new leaders emerged and saw themselves as demigods, as protectors and even owners of their domains. Ultimately, this was instrumental in creating a lot of dictatorships. Now, the failure to achieve the tenets of Pan-Africanism, what that has meant is that we've never had any real unity on the African continent. Now, let's think about the Democratic Republic of the Congo, one of the richest resource countries in the world, but also one of the most wretched countries. Why? Because it is isolated in its struggles. So when multinational corporations and other nations want to exploit its resources and encourage conflict so that they can exploit the resources of the land, the Democratic Republic of the Congo finds itself alone. It's isolated. And I learned recently that about 14 former French colonies continue to pay to this day the equivalent of taxes to France, supposedly for what France did for them during colonialism. This is not common knowledge. These countries dole out every year up to $500 billion. Now, why do they continue to be exploited? Why do they continue to go through this injustice? Why are they constantly exploited? Because they're isolated. If the continent worked together, we would come together, and problems within the DRC and the problems that these former French colonies are facing, we would confront them head on. But it's nobody's business. My business is within my location, my territory. Whatever is happening out there does not concern me. That is the general notion on the African continent. That seems to be the philosophy, and that seems to be taking place, also what's taking place here in Nigeria, and even in the eastern region, or the Niger Delta area. Now, Pan-Africanism as a political movement may have failed, but Pan-Africanism as a political philosophy need not fail. We need to develop a political philosophy that highlights the things that connect us. Reclaiming the harmony, sense of community, and fluid interconnections of the past is crucial now, perhaps more than ever before. I'd like to propose what I describe here as new directions and perspectives. Now, I refer to the Aros and the Ibibios and a lot of the things they share in common. It's not just the Aros and the Ibibios. If you move from one end of the so-called Niger Delta to the other, you'll find a lot of similarities. Social, cultural similarities, artistic similarities, in terms of how we organize our families, how we dress, our foods, our dances. I think it's very interesting that one of the things that we found very offensive was stealing. Perhaps next to murder, stealing was a major crime. How interesting that on some levels we tend to revere and honor the thieves amongst us. I'm not going to say much about that. I'm just going to move on. Now, so we should focus on what we share and empower ourselves with our commonalities. Today, this transcends culture, religion, and art. We now have, and it's not just religion, art, and culture. We now have similar struggles and shared problems. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't celebrate our individual ethnic identities and spaces. I'm not saying that. But we can look at what I'm saying from this perspective. Imagine our cultures as part of a larger human experience. Think of a musical instrument, for instance. The trumpet sounds great, but the best harmony within the trumpet you can get when the trumpet plays in association with other musical instruments. Or think about a leaf on a tree. A leaf has its own attributes, but those attributes are meaningless if you pluck the leaf from the tree. It's in those terms that I would like us to start thinking of our individual identities and cultural experiences and customs, not as something that should isolate us, but as something that should connect us. And in our connections, the richness of who we are will come out even more. We cannot continue to exist in isolation and continue to wonder why we are powerless in the face of many economic and political threats. I strongly recommend developing knowledge, not education as we understand it. It's possible to get an education and not get knowledge, or get an education and not get enlightenment. But we need practical education with a strong civics component, so that we begin to understand ourselves a little bit more and understand those around us a little bit more. And when we connect, it won't be over accusations and attacks and condemnation, but when we connect, we would connect over celebrating ourselves. We need to focus on what connects us and what to celebrate about ourselves. We shouldn't focus, like the youth corpers, on whatever it is that we think divides us. Between, say, the Ikwu people and the Igbo people, there's so much room to do research and find the commonalities between the people and focus on those commonalities rather than focus on whatever we think divides us. We should revisit history with a new sense of objectivity, so we stop making enemies of ourselves. You see, as we make enemies of ourselves, we tend to ignore who our real enemies are. Ignore who our real enemies are. They just sit back and take advantage of the disagreements that we have between ourselves. We spend too much time accusing and stereotyping ourselves, and if you don't believe me, check out the language and the rhetoric, for instance, on social media. Now, leadership is central to all of this. If you look at any regional or ethnic conflicts that have taken place, they've usually been caused by divisive, self-seeking leaders, whether they are political or religious leaders, or prominent people in the community, and not the people. This was the case in Nazi Germany. This was the case in Rwanda. This was the case even in northern Nigeria. Practical education will eliminate the mindset that causes us to perceive and treat our leaders like demigods. So when they ask us to kill our neighbors, we say no. But if we think they are gods, whatever they ask us to do, we will do them. We need to demystify our leaders. We are significantly responsible for making our leaders act like gods because we treat them like gods. And someone would say, how? Well, I can throw out a few examples. When they come to our communities, we give them chieftaincy titles. Even the ones we accuse of being liars and thieves and murderers. And when they come to our churches, we give them front row seats. When they come to our universities, we give them honorary degrees. There was and we of course give them national awards and name institutions, bridges, and roads after them. We talk from both sides of our mouths. I remember when I lived in Port Harcourt and a certain president came there and he was given 2 wives in one of the communities. And they asked the people, why did you give him 2 wives? And they said, it's our culture. And I said, well, I've been living here longer than this man, even girlfriend. You know, so we need to stop this thing. Through practical education, we will begin to produce an electorate also that won't vote along ethnic or religious lines. But they look at politicians and look at their agenda on education, health, infrastructure, agriculture, power, unity, and so forth. Now we have to start thinking differently, and I'm winding down here, and think for ourselves no matter how radical it may seem. For instance, we need to start rejecting or rethinking the alien notion that democracy equals multi-party politics and periodic elections. It has never worked for us, and it never will. If former President Julius Nyerere could completely squash ethnic sentiments in a country with over 100 ethnic groups, why is it impossible in the Niger Delta, or at least in the former Eastern region? The NYSC would have gone a long way in demolishing destructive boundaries, but it has been plagued by corruption. At least that was the case when I served. I don't know if it's changed since then. Besides, when most people are done with the NYSC, they are quick to return to their states and what they believe is the comfort and security of their regional and ethnic communities. However, NYSC as a concept is brilliant. We should therefore consider other ways of achieving its laudable goals. Perhaps its principles can be used to build bridges at regional levels before going national or international. In other words, how can we still achieve and apply its core values? Youth, young people. Young people are not the future, young people are the present. Service and togetherness, which is what core incorporates. Now here are my final thoughts on some of our most disturbing threats today, whether it's Boko Haram, kidnapping, invading Fulani herdsmen. We speak with different voices. That's the first problem. Divided, we will never win this war. The good news, however, is that these problems can actually unite us. This is not the first time people have been butchered in large numbers. The same or worse happened to us, mainly Igbos, before, during, and after the Civil War. We must therefore view the ongoing epidemic of violence as part of a history where people have used violence to get what they want without any consequences. We keep acting as if it's new. Look at what's happening. It happened before, okay? It's just that you didn't care or you didn't know about it. All these communities and people that are screaming out against Fulani herdsmen, where were they when similar atrocities were committed in the past? More recently, when pro-Biafran groups, whether you agree with them or not, when they were physically assaulted and even murdered, what did any of you say? Some of these people that are screaming, some of them and their communities were even instrumental in committing similar acts of brutality when it was conducive for them to do so. Essentially, many speak about these issues as selfish hypocrites, not because they care, but because the danger is coming close to them. To protest only when your ethnic group or region is threatened is to further create disunity. If we must seriously condemn mass violence, we must condemn past acts of communal violence and even call for overdue restitution. Only then can we truly begin to reconnect and reconcile. Otherwise, many of us, including myself, are going to remain indignant and ask the question, why should we unite with you to fight this common enemy? After all, you were not with us when we were being assaulted and brutalized. And finally, this is my last 2 points here. We often look for external forces as causes of our problems without considering the most important factor, which is ourselves, and perhaps our inadequacies. Today, even if we can talk about external enemies, our greatest enemy is our isolation from one another and our inability to come together in a constructive way. Thank you very much.